Plays a critical role, and no one actually has a greater role in these efforts than our Executive Vice President, Dan Mariaschin. Dan's knowledge of Jewish issues, his depth of commitment to the Jewish people, and his ability to express that knowledge as clear, easily understood statements means that B'nai B'rith appears frequently in the news media. You may think that since Dan said such nice things when he introduced me at lunch, that I'm obligated to return that favor. But I would do so anyway. I can tell you, I really mean it when I say we are uniquely gifted to have someone of Dan's caliber leading our organization on the professional side. One thing I might tell you also is I have never met anybody who has a remembrance of people's names and faces and is so readily recognized no matter where we go. We walk into a parliament building or we walk into an embassy in a foreign country, and these foreign ambassadors, they know who he is. I mean, it's unbelievable. And part of that is he remembers their name as well, which is unique, something I could never do. We are going to hear from Dan today about a report on what B'nai B'rith is addressing in the challenges that are facing our global Jewish community. I don't think I need to introduce to you any further the person who I would consider as one of the top professionals, if not the top professionals, in organized Jewish life today. It's my pleasure to ask Dan to come to the microphone for his report.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you for your kind words. I'm going to do one thing very, very quickly because we are running really way behind. But I want to do this now. It's usually done at the end of the meeting, but we have a critical mass of folks here, so I want to thank our staff, the staff that put together this meeting. And Mark Olshan, my colleague, our Associate Executive Vice President, heads that list. He's a go-to guy, does a lot of different things. He goes back to B'nai B'rith conventions in the past. He knows how to do this, and he supervises a great team. And I want to mention those names now while everybody is in the room. And I'll start with Janelle Doughton. Many of you, is Janelle in the room? Well, she's with the housing. She's doing 2 meetings during this week. And Janelle is really the person who keeps tabs on registration, the hotel, the meals, the whole business, and just terrific. But I'll go through the list. They're in the room. Please, as they say, hold your applause unless you feel you want to applaud. It's up to you. Sharon Bender, Anya Wolska-Lee, and Anya, unfortunately, is going to leave us in a few days, going on to bigger and better things. She's been a great colleague. Felice Kaspar, whom most of you know, just indispensable to this organization. Jeff Mandel, who directs membership and fundraising. Rhonda Love, our VP for program. Rhonda is becoming the institutional memory. She's young, but the institutional memory of this organization. A great colleague. Eric Fussfield, who handles 2 positions for us in Center for Public Policy. Anthony Clark, Anthony's not here, heads our central operations. Zach Kaiser, Taylor Schwenk, Sam Seifman, and Simia Montesa. And one more, Harvey Burke, who's not here, but Harvey put the script together. So he really is the authority on B'nai B'rith scripts. But I want to thank everybody for all they've done for this meeting. Well, like some of you, even though I had a very strong Jewish upbringing, but my coming of age, in terms of the issues that we face, really came on the 5th of June, 1967. And the Six-Day War had a tremendous impact on so many of us. Well, it's 48 years ago, and I don't think that I have seen a time, and we've had some difficult spots. We've had the Yom Kippur War, of course, and we've had the Lebanon War, the first Lebanon War. There have been some very difficult moments, the war with the PLO. But I don't think I can remember a Middle East, and dare I say a world, as chaotic as it is today. It's not just what we used to call the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's a lot of conflicts, and they're all going on at the same time. And believe me, it gives us no pleasure. It gives us no satisfaction. Many of us used to say, people would say, well, if you solve the Israeli-Palestinian issue, wow, that would be the key to solving every other problem in the Middle East. That's not the case. Just ask anyone in Syria today, or in Iraq today, or the opposition such as it is in Iran, or those who are the victims of the Houthis in Yemen. I mean, I would go on and on. And so I don't remember a more chaotic moment. And we are all in the middle of it. All of us in B'nai B'rith, all of us in the Jewish community, all of us as citizens of the community of democracies. Now, this year, the U.S. and the international community faced an opportunity to prevent the growth of instability in the world's most combustible region by committing themselves to preventing Iran from becoming a nuclear-armed state. Did the Iran nuclear deal negotiated by the U.S. and its partners, known as the P5+1, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council plus Germany, make this outcome more likely or less? Well, let's examine the evidence. One could argue that the restrictions placed on Iran's nuclear program over the next 10 to 15 years will make it more difficult for Iran to advance its weapons capability in the short term. And any significant violation of international sanctions is supposed to allow those sanctions to snap back into place without other countries vetoing U.S. action at the UN Security Council. But what happens after 10 to 15 years, which is really an eye blink in Middle East terms? Iran would then have the latitude to produce enough enriched fuel for a nuclear weapon in a short period of time. Deterrence at that point, however, will have become infinitely more difficult and perilous. And unburdened by sanctions and empowered by new investment and trade opportunities, which it's enjoying right now, Iran will have regained its economic equilibrium, asserted its regional hegemony, which it's doing right now, and normalized its status as an international actor in, quote, good standing. B'nai B'rith has publicly opposed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action known as the JCPOA, as the deal is known, in part because it has already legitimized Iran's nuclear program, a fact underscored by the UN Security Council's decision to immediately remove the legal underpinning for the international sanctions against Iran. The agreement effectively provides Iran with both a legal path toward an industrial-scale nuclear program and a green light for strengthened international economic engagement. On top of refraining from penalizing Iran for bad behavior, the U.S. and its partners commit to assist Iran to develop in energy, in finance, in technology, and in trade. As soon as the agreement was signed, actually, before it was, we don't even know yet whether it was ratified by the Iranians or not, there were big trade delegations going from Germany and Austria and Italy. Trade delegations that were led by senior figures in those governments. The idea that America and its allies will actually help Iran grow stronger in these areas is certain to spread anxiety throughout the Middle East, where the Iranians are viewed as the masterminds behind Bashar Assad's brutal suppression of his people, the Houthi rebellion against state authority in Yemen, the creeping expansion of radical Shiite influence in Iraq, and the activities of some of the most extreme Palestinian terrorist organizations. Among the JCPOA's many flaws are its challenge period of up to 24 days for international inspection should Iran deny access to an undeclared site. The deal also does not compel Iran's disclosure of the possible military dimensions of its weapons program. And senior leaders of the P5+1 have said, well, that's all of that, the military dimensions in the past. What we have to deal with today is the present. And it lifts the UN arms embargo and ballistic missile sanctions. But perhaps most perplexing on a conceptual level is its language stipulating that the parties shall implement the agreement, quote, in good faith based on mutual respect, close quote. The regime from whom we are requesting good faith is one that annually convenes the world's most notorious anti-Semites and Holocaust deniers. has very recently affirmed its intention to destroy Israel. It does this every day. It doesn't matter. One day it's Khamenei, one day it's the head of the Al-Quds force, one day it's somebody else. Every day, they call for Israel's destruction. It encourages mobs that shout, you saw this a couple of days ago, death to America and death to Israel, and has deceived the international community for years over its continued pursuit of nuclear weapons, despite the determined efforts of negotiators to stop it. Iran also maintains its place as the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism. Hezbollah, Iran's chief client, launched a war against Israel in 2006 and has improved its military capabilities since then, having acquired an arsenal that some say approaches 100,000 rockets and missiles, much of it provided by Iran. Iran is also a serial human rights abuser, the worst abuser of the rights of juvenile offenders, for example, of women, of the Baha'i religion, of political opponents. And it holds, right now, another 2, it holds 5, 6 American hostages. You know, if this Iranian agreement had been comprehensive, it would have dealt with terror, it would have dealt with human rights, it would have dealt with the hostages that are being held right now. And the decision was, well, you know, if you can crack this nuclear nut and you can solve that issue, everything is falling into place. Well, on the contrary. And so American hostages, I think one originally Iranian and one originally Lebanese, but holding American citizenship, have been abducted and are being held by the Iranians right now. Since the agreement was signed. Since the agreement was signed. In the wake of this severely flawed nuclear deal, the U.S. should make clear, as it has not yet done, that Iran will never be permitted to obtain nuclear weapons, and that all options, we know what that means, all options, including military options, remain on the table. Any transgression, any act of noncompliance indicating a move toward a nuclear weapon must be met with a penalty from the United States. It may not be met with penalties by the P5+1. It may not be met by penalties from the EU, but at least the United States has to make it clear that any transgressions will be met with penalties. The U.S. should further insist that no sanctions relief will be provided to Iran until it meets its commitments related to the issue of possible military dimensions. And it should make clear that nothing in the agreement precludes new sanctions legislation or the preservation of existing sanctions addressing terrorism, human rights abuses, and ballistic missile activities. Just last month, after the agreement was signed, Iran defied the international community by testing 2 medium-range ballistic missiles designed to carry nuclear warheads. The Imad missile, developed in Iran, is a precision-guided weapon that is the first of its kind with the capability of reaching Israel or U.S. military bases in the Middle East. The international community should stand firm in its determination to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. We must also agree to counter Iranian support for terrorism and confront Iranian violations of ballistic missile protocols and international human rights violations. They're just flouting it. You know, a lot said about Rouhani, who's the relatively new president of Iran, the successor to the nefarious Ahmadinejad. You know, Rouhani dresses better, looks better, right? Got that trim beard, doesn't wear that members-only jacket, you know, that Ahmadinejad used to wear. He's kind of a cool, you know, looking guy. More executions have occurred under his presidency in Iran than under his predecessor. So, defenders of human rights everywhere must take more seriously Iran's stated desire to eradicate Israel and its repeated use of anti-Semitic invective and Holocaust denial. Iran's repeated threats to destroy the state of Israel must be viewed with utmost gravity, particularly in light of Iran's ongoing pursuit of nuclear weapons and its unswerving sponsorship of terrorism. You know, I can't understand it. I'm not going to make the exact analogies to the 1930s, although you could. Hitler was out there for how many years? Came to power in April of 1933. right? The war started on September 1 of 1939. The Wannsee Villa Declaration for the eradication of the Jews, for the final solution, was in 1942. He wrote Mein Kampf, I think, in 1924. So he was saying it all along. He was saying it all along. People looked the other way, didn't care, called him a buffoon, all of those things that we know. The Iranians, since they took over in February of 1979, have been calling for the destruction of the State of Israel. And none other than Alan Dershowitz, Nat Lewin, Erwin Kotler, eminent jurists, eminent parliamentarians, have sought to go after Iran for what they say is a call for genocide. It's a call for genocide against the State of Israel, and that really means against the Jewish people. And no one seems to be exercised except Dershowitz and Lewin and Kotler and their friends, their colleagues, and us, and of course, the State of Israel. Closer to home for Israelis, another severe challenge has been realized as a wave of random and deadly attacks against Israeli civilians has raised tensions throughout the country and in the region. You know, I don't know, today I just checked, there were another 6 people, I think, who were attacked today, or 4 people attacked today, and in Israel. A Palestinian youth stabbed an Israeli woman in the back in Rishon LeZion. In eastern Jerusalem, 2 Palestinian men attempted to overtake a bus, shooting and stabbing passengers, ultimately killing 2 people and injuring 10. That attack this morning, by the way, was one of these car ramming incidents where people were waiting at a bus stop. In central Jerusalem, a man drove a car into a bus stop. This is before, killing 1 person and then leaving the vehicle to stab others. He was shot and wounded by an Israeli security guard. Elsewhere in Jerusalem, 13-year-old boy was stabbed a dozen times. Policeman was stabbed and a soldier was attacked on a bus. And in Ra'anana, 4 people were stabbed in 2 separate attacks. A knife-wielding terrorist murdered 2 men, Chamia Levi, 41, and Aaron Bennett, 22. Levi was killed when he reportedly ran to help Bennett. You may have read about it as the attack was underway. Bennett's wife is hospitalized with serious stab wounds. The couple's 2-year-old was also injured. And in a second terror attack 12 hours later, a 15-year-old Israeli boy was stabbed in the back and chest. And just days earlier, Palestinian gunmen shot and killed a young couple as they drove with their children. You remember that. These attacks are ongoing and present a gruesome picture of the latest series of anti-Jewish violence that has engulfed Jerusalem. This has nothing to do with settlements. It has nothing to do with negotiations. When you seek out Jews on the street, they don't know. The people who are stabbed in the street, they don't know whether they're Likud, they're Labor, they're this, they're that. They don't know whether they're followers of Bennett or they're followers of Herzog. They don't ask them before they stab. Are you a follower of Bibi? If you are, I'll stab you. If you're a follower of Bennett, I'll stab you. If you're a follower of, whatever, I won't. It's not how it works. It's not how it works. This is random violence. It's at random, we'll get to that in a minute, against Jews. Because you could be in the street. I could be in the street. I have a niece. Many of you have relatives in Israel. You probably got the same story. I have a niece. She has a little girl who's just under 3 years old. For the first 10 days of this latest series of stabbings, her daughter was kept at home. Her daughter was kept at home. They didn't want to go out in the street. This is like these rocket attacks where people couldn't go to the bathroom, couldn't take a shower. That's where we are today. So is this a third intifada? Well, we've yet to come to a consensus on that. In Gaza, senior Hamas leader Mahmoud al-Zahar said a few weeks ago that the third Palestinian intifada had already started. And neither Israel nor the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas will be able to stop it. Some have come to reference this as the knife intifada, or the intifada of the young. Others are not rushing to declare it, perhaps out of deference to the weight of such labeling. There are others, like Bernard-Henri Lévy, who is no champion of this particular Israeli government, one of France's most famed philosophers and journalists, who disagree entirely. Lévy wrote an article that appeared in the Allgemeiner a few weeks ago with a very poignant message. Quote, "It is highly doubtful that intifada is the right term to apply to acts that bear more resemblance to the latest installment of a worldwide jihad, of which Israel is just one of the stages. We stand on the threshold of a form of barbarity that must be unconditionally denounced if we do not want to see its methods exported elsewhere." What we can agree on, however, is that like the two previous intifadas, today's riots began as random events, but soon became the fodder for Palestinian leaders to inflame the situation. With violence and incendiary rhetoric mounting, the resulting panic in the streets and the concern has established a new normal for life for every Israeli citizen. Where are the Palestinian leaders condemning this violence? Where are they harnessing this activity? With the help of social media, religious incitement has fueled the bloodshed. It was Mahmoud Abbas, Israel's putative interlocutor for the peace process, right? You don't have anybody better than him. Ask any of the people in the P5+1 or others in the West. He's the guy who's going to make the agreement. We could go through the list. He's the one who said Jews are trying to desecrate the Al-Aqsa with their filthy feet. With their filthy feet. And there wasn't one word of condemnation. Not one. Not from here. Not from Europe. Not one. Not from the UN. Our filthy feet. Now, people criticize Abbas for his silence. But isn't his silence? He said it. He said it. You cannot have it both ways. There are a lot of people out there who think, well, Israel's the stronger and the Palestinians are the weaker, and therefore Israel has to do certain things and the Palestinians don't have to do anything because they're the weaker party. This is not about settlements. Settlements are an issue. I want to say that right now. If you come to Shabbat dinner, I've said this before, you come to Shabbat dinner, my family in Israel, around that table you'll see far left, far right, and everybody in between. It's an issue. Just like borders are an issue, and electricity is an issue, and water is an issue, security is an issue, refugees, Jerusalem. It's not the be-all and end-all. What is the business with our filthy feet? The last person to call us filthy, forgetting the Iranians because they talk about Israel as a cancer that has to be extirpated, were those in the 1930s. Yes, we were referred to as vermin. And nobody said anything then. And nobody's saying anything now. Except U.S. Congressional Representatives Ed Royce and Eliot Engel, Democrat and Republican, wrote a letter to Abbas calling for an end to Palestinian incitement. B'nai B'rith International praised this bipartisan effort, encouraging more members to join them to publicly condemn the murderous wave of terror that has engulfed Israel. The House of Representatives last week passed Resolution 293, which formally denounces anti-Israel and anti-Semitic incitement in the West Bank. And too often, Israel is the victim of baseless attacks from governments and international bodies with a severely skewed view of the Middle East. Let me give you an example. Last week, I won't name the country, but it's a country in the Western Hemisphere that has a pretty good bilateral relationship with Israel. I met with the ambassador. And at the United Nations, that country voted on 17 of the 21 biased anti-Israel resolutions that come before the General Assembly. If I gave you the name of the country, you'd say, whoa, I visited there before. I've taken a vacation there before. It's a good relationship with Israel. 16 times that country voted against Israel. And the 17th, they abstained. So I said to the ambassador, is it possible? Is it possible that Israel is wrong 100% of the time? Every single time? Did you have to vote against Israel? By the way, he didn't see that as being anti-Israel. He saw this as fostering a negotiation. That's how he saw it. And I told him, you want to foster a negotiation? You want to bring the parties to the table? You have a good line of contact with the Palestinians? You have a good voting record for the Palestinians? It's time to tell the Palestinians, go to the table. Go to the table. But the Palestinians don't want to go to the table, and why should they go to the table? The international community is behind them. Just over a month ago, Abba spoke in front of the UN General Assembly, whitewashing the attacks on Jews at the Temple Mount and claiming that Palestinians are, quote, working to spread the culture of peace while simultaneously disavowing signed agreements with Israel. These actions reflect deep-rooted, officially sanctioned anti-Semitism and anti-Israel fanaticism, which remains absent from the dialogue surrounding these attacks. The refusal to hold Arab leaders accountable, and thank God for Engel and Royce, for violence committed by their citizens is a stark reminder that they have not been subject to the severe international opprobrium that they deserve. Now let's talk about the Temple Mount. People have it wrong. They're just wrong. 48 years ago, right? Israel came into possession. You remember, was it Mota Gur, General Gur, who said that famous statement? You could hear the crackling of the radio. And Mota Gur said, the Temple Mount is in our hands, right? The Temple Mount is in our hands. So what happened? You know what Israel could have done? The next day, let's come on up and pray. We're going to, or let's deny Islamic prayer. But that's not what they did. You know, today they say, will Israel maintain the status quo? Will Bibi maintain the status quo? Everybody's so worried the status quo. What is the history of the status quo? History of the status quo is like this. When Israel was in control, came into control, the then government of Israel, which was a coalition government, left and right, a coalition government made the following decision. It was not going to allow Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount. That wasn't a decision from the Arabs. It wasn't a decision from the Muslims. They lost. It was a decision from Israel. And there were two reasons for it. The rabbis, the chief rabbinate said, you can't have prayer. Why? On that spot. Because if you step on that spot, it might be the Holy of Holies. And if it's a Holy of Holies, that's desecrated. And then there was a more practical reason. The more practical reason was they didn't want to provoke the Islamic community. They didn't want to provoke the Muslims. So what did they do? They put the area in under the supervision of the Waqf, under the Muslim Council. And so over the years, what's happened is, if you go up to the Temple Mount, and I've been up, and some you've been up, but prayer is not permitted. If you so much as whisper a prayer up there, you can get arrested, or you can be pulled away. But over the years, because of the magnanimity of the decision made in 1967 and the subsequent follow-up on that status quo decision by a series of governments left and right in Israel, what people think today is, it's the area is holy to the Jews, but it's really holy to the Muslims. And what are the Jews? What are you doing up here? Don't put your dirty feet up here. And so most people haven't been paying attention. Over 48 years, people say, something, that the Muslims have a point. What are the Jews doing? They're trying to prevent something here, trying to take over the Al-Aqsa Mosque. What are you doing? So that's the status quo. But Israel gets no credit for having done this. I would have done it differently. Frankly, on June 6th or 7th or 8th or whenever it was they came into power in Jerusalem, control of Jerusalem, I would have said, look, Jews can pray from 8 to 10, Muslims can pray from 10 to 12, and make sure the Muslims get in 5 and we get in 3, and that's how you do it. But they didn't do it that way. They didn't do it that way. And so Israel now gets punished. And what do they get punished? You get punished by having riots and stabbings. UN spokesperson Stefan Dujarric characterized Israel's utterly restrained response to the current wave of Palestinian terrorism as a, quote, an apparent excessive use of force, and indicated that Secretary General Ban Ki-moon would want a serious review of Israeli defensive measures. But only Israeli civilians have been attacked by knives, vehicles, and attempted suicide bombings. The UN's overt and consistent misrepresentation of the situation is unforgivable. Now, excessive use of force. Listen, every community that you come from, we all know. You get one stabbing in the street, two stabbings in the street, the police are out there, they see somebody going to stab somebody else. Maybe they shout a warning, maybe they don't. They take out their revolver or whatever it is that they've got next to them, and they shoot the person carrying out the act of attempting to murder somebody else. And Israel is taken to task by Mr. Dujarric, or taken to task by the New York Times, or taken to task by these sanctimonious folks in Europe for its excessive use of force. What excessive use of force? And I ask you again, it has nothing to do with settlements. It has to do with defending the lives of Israelis in the street. What people in the world today, authoritarian dictatorships, democracies, monarchies, whatever you have, what people would allow for one day this business to happen, and who would blame them for wanting to end it? And lest the world forget the neighboring conflicts in the gas fields of Syria. Let's just take that. Where hundreds of civilians' lives are being lost at the hands of the Islamic State, ISIS, in a single day of fighting. Or what about the horrific atrocities being carried out by ISIS against Christians and minorities in Iraq? When Israel's critics speak of proportionality, their outrage is sorely misdirected. And friends of Israel need to be clear, there is no moral equivalency between Israel and these terrorists. They have to stop trying to explain these stabbings because of frustration. Because the folks who are doing this are not they're not stabbing Israelis in order to get everybody back to the peace table. That's not their intention. But they get a pass. Instead of presenting the facts, the media also fails in its duties, merely mimicking the Palestinian narrative. Palestinians allege that a wave of attacks in recent weeks against Israeli civilians and security personnel stems from attempts to change the arrangements on the Temple Mount. We've talked about that. Israel's not changing the status quo. But the press continues to repeat and repeat and repeat, notwithstanding the fact that that is not the case. And I'm sure that the Prime Minister of Israel, I don't know this for sure, but I'm guessing, if there'd be some way to allow Jews to pray on the Temple Mount, maybe he would go along with it. But he's not doing that. He's not doing that because, again, they want to preserve the status quo. Now, last month I wrote to CNN's Vice President of News Standards and Practices and USA Today's standards editor to point out deeply flawed and biased reporting in their recent coverage of the Palestinian attacks on Jews in Israel. CNN, a barometer oftentimes biased in its sentiments. And why do I say that? I don't just say it. I mean, I remember when it was known. You remember during Operation Protective Edge when the Indian journalist and the French journalist reported that they saw with their own eyes the firing of rockets from civilian locations against Israel? And the CNN reporter was asked by Wolf Blitzer if he had, what did he think of that? And he said, with a straight face to Wolf, he said that he himself had not seen any of that, so he couldn't really comment on it. Well, journalists clearly speak to each other, and I'm sure that journalist had seen the firing. So we wrote to them. CNN confirmed its reputation by reporting on the situation with the use of the nebulous violence to characterize the shootings, car attacks, and the knifings of Jews, which maliciously mischaracterizes the situation by omitting who's perpetrating the attacks, Palestinians, and omitting who the victims are, Israelis. And we can show you, and you've seen it time and again, the reports on this. It'll say if two Palestinians were shot trying to knife Israelis, a lot of times the headline will be 2 Palestinians shot, by Israelis. And that's what this letter was about. While this suppressed language may be ideologically convenient for CNN, it is extremely offensive. The reporter's transparent effort to protect the Palestinian terrorists is suspect throughout their entire coverage. A USA Today article 2 weeks ago, it says, quote, "This latest Palestinian uprising is a Facebook intifada." Nice little name. Likewise, ignores organized incitement from Abbas and others at the top levels of the Palestinian Authority and in the terrorist group Hamas. Instead, it explains away the latest murderous attacks on the Jews of Israel in the gentlest terms. The incomplete and irresponsible reporting by these and other media outlets ignores the facts on the ground. Bias by omission is exactly that, bias. There are so many examples of this kind of reportage that bias has become broadly recognized as the norm, not the exception. In reality, Israel has imposed more security measures, including the widening police stop and frisk powers and the deployment of police and troop reinforcements throughout Israel. Israeli police officers are subject to strict rules that govern the use of deadly force, which is permitted only in life-threatening situations. The Palestinians indiscriminately attack civilians on the street. Should Israel be blamed for successfully protecting its civilians and seeking nothing more than to have a peaceful situation at home? But even more incredible than that is that the Palestinian Authority has been rewarded by the UN and by others for its activity. Historically, the Palestinians have used all means available to them in pursuit of unilateral action. Most notably, the UN has become a full-fledged political propaganda arm against the Jewish state. 3 Palestinian committees. There is the Division on Palestinian Rights in the Secretariat. You have the Division of Asians. You have the Division of Asia, a Division of Europe. You have the Division of the Americas. You have the divisions, and there's a division for the Palestinians in the Secretariat of the United Nations. There isn't one for the Kurds, and there isn't one for, you name whoever. But there's one for the Palestinians. And then there's the Committee on the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinians, and then there's the Committee on the Israeli Human Rights Abuses in the Territories. You know what the Committee on the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinians does? It's funded to the tune of millions of dollars, and what it does is it sponsors photo exhibitions and conferences around the world which advance the Palestinian narrative. Now, this is the United Nations. The United Nations is to be an objective player. It's a member of the quartet, all of those things. And yet, under its own roof, it funds these organizations which advance the Palestinian cause. One of the most glaring examples of this in recent years in the UN can be found in UN General Assembly Resolution 67/19 from November of 2012, which upgraded Palestinians to non-member observer status at the UN. The resolution implicitly recognized Palestinian sovereignty and removed the impetus for the Palestinians to sit in earnest at the negotiating table for direct talks with Israel. This bias is just the tip of the iceberg when compounded by a sustained and ruthless campaign in the UN to delegitimize the State of Israel. Rooted in the notorious 1975 UN resolution equating Zionism and racism, the 40th anniversary this fall, the 40th anniversary this fall, 1975, of the Zionism-Racism Resolution. But Israel's enemies over the years have streamlined their modern hatred of Jews into the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the BDS movement, in an attempt to demonize the Jewish state. They have brought this pernicious battle to university campuses, academic institutions, human rights NGOs, even some church groups. And the broad accusations raised by the BDS crowd find themselves today at the center of public discourse in capitals around the world. During the summer 2014 conflict in Gaza, the UN Human Rights Council issued a one-sided resolution assigning blame for the conflict to Israel. And this is my favorite. Honestly, this is my favorite UN Human Rights Council resolution. This resolution on the war in Gaza runs 5 pages, single-spaced. And it's on the fighting, right, between Israel and Hamas. It doesn't mention the word Hamas once. Hamas is not part of the resolution on the war with Hamas. What the resolution does, how do you get to 5 pages? That's a lot of verbiage, single-spaced. You get to 5 pages because they kept referencing one resolution after another that have been already adopted by the UN, which we consider to be anti-Israel. The resolution called for a commission of inquiry, reminiscent of the one-sided Goldstone Commission created after the first Israel-Hamas war in 2008-09. And this one-sided anti-Israel resolution, brought to the UN Human Rights Council by such noted human rights abusers as Pakistan and Venezuela, and filled with the sort of hackneyed anti-Israel diatribes for which the Council is well known, took aim at Israel for a laundry list of supposed human rights violations, including Israel's pursuit of Hamas terrorists in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. Just this year alone, the campaign to isolate the State of Israel while offering unilateral concessions to the Palestinians has garnered the Palestinians innumerable propaganda points. Palestinians have been granted sovereign recognition by individual states, like the Vatican. Their flag is now being flown outside the UN headquarters in New York, despite the fact that Palestine does not yet exist as a full member of the UN, like everybody else. The European Union passed a resolution right out of the BDS handbook to label goods originating in the West Bank. And the UN recommended that Israel be placed on the list of entities that regularly and systematically harm children in conflict situations, along with serial human rights abusers and terrorists, the like of the Taliban and Boko Haram and ISIS. Indeed, this is an upside-down world. It should be the PA, the Palestinian Authority, and its leaders that receive international opprobrium, and not Israel. Should not be rewarded for their incitement to violence against Israel and the Jewish people by having international ire directed at Israel. Now, this year, I think Alan alluded to it, as we have every year, B'nai B'rith sent a senior delegation of leaders, professionals, and partners around the country and around the world to the opening of the 70th session of the UN General Assembly in New York. While Abbas was disavowing signed agreements with Israel in his speech to the GA, B'nai B'rith held a marathon session of side meetings with numerous presidents, prime ministers, foreign ministers, and other senior officials. We raised exactly these issues, this unacceptable abandonment and this isolation of Israel. We urged officials to reject Palestinian efforts to export tensions with Israel to and achieve unearned political objectives at the United Nations, rather than engaging in necessary direct negotiations, compromise, and agreement with the Jewish state. And let me say one word about negotiations. B'nai B'rith endorses a two-state solution. We endorse a two-state solution because it's the right thing. We endorse a two-state solution. We want an Israel at peace. I referenced before my niece. Between my wife and myself, we have more than 200 relatives living in Israel. More than 200. There isn't a year that goes by, there isn't a month that goes by that we don't have a nephew, a niece, a cousin who's serving in the IDF. Does anybody think for a minute that we want to put those kids in harm's way? That's what we're doing. We're being critical of the Palestinians, and we're defending Israel. What's that all about? How about an agreement? Can't we all, live together? Who wouldn't want it? What Israeli parent wants this? But there's a way to do it, and a way not to do it. And as long as the international community continues to indulge the Palestinians at the UN, as long as governments who should know better continue to indulge the Palestinian community. That vote, by the way, on my favorite UN resolution, that vote was carried in the Human Rights Council, 29 votes for, 1 vote against, it was the United States, and 17 abstentions. And of the 17 abstentions, 10 of them were European countries, and of the 10 European countries, 8 of them were in the European Union. And the leader of the EU on that group, the EU group on that particular vote, was the UK. Now, this resolution dealt with the indiscriminate firing of rockets into Israeli population centers. Now, what country in the last 80 years, 75 years, what country can most identify with what Israel was going through during that war with Gaza? It would be the UK. Rockets, V1s, V2s, fired indiscriminately into London, into southeastern England, fired every day. Thousands and thousands of dead and casualties. And the UK could only abstain on a resolution that didn't even mention Hamas. And you know what they did? You know how they defended? They do this all the time. They say, well, we spoke to countries that abstained. They said, well, he should have seen the language when they brought it to us. We really worked hard to make sure that, they go on and on about how the language is better. I don't want the language to be better. I want you to stand up for principle. I want you to do what the United States did. This shouldn't be 29-117. What's that all about? Why is it that on something as simple, as easy, as automatic, as defending a sister democracy under attack by rockets that are being fired indiscriminately into population centers, you can't even bring yourself to join and vote against? And so, I have to look at the 1930s, and I have to look at today. I'm not going to call it the abandonment of the Jews. I'm not going to call it, with respect to David Wyman, who wrote the book, I'm not going to call it the abandonment of Israel, but that's how it smells to me. That's how it looks to me. No condemnation of filthy feet. No condemnation of the daily threats to destroy the state of Israel from Iran. No condemnation of the stabbings, unequivocal, of the stabbings in the street. Instead, we get the back of everybody's hand. Israel gets the back of everybody's hand. You should know better. You should do. You should this. You should that. Excessive force. It's wrong. It's plain wrong. And this organization, I can tell you, every opportunity we have to set the record straight, I don't say we're going to convince everybody, every opportunity we have to set the record straight, we will do it. Now, given the hostility to Israel at the UN and the almost automatic majority that the Palestinians enjoy within the confines of its institutions, it's easy to see why the Palestinians thought they could exploit the situation even further, to make an even bolder move. And what did they do just a few weeks ago? The bolder move was, Stefan is nodding in agreement because he was right there at the ground zero at UNESCO. Their objective was the Kotel Hamaravi. Their objective was the Western Wall. So last month, a number of Arab states submitted on behalf of the Palestinians a resolution to UNESCO's executive board that named the Kotel as Al-Burak Plaza and announced that it was an integral part of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. But this outrageous move was one step too far. It exposed clearly for the world to see who in reality is trying to change the status quo in Jerusalem. It was rightly seen as the Palestinians, via UNESCO, trying to erase history, rob the Jews and the Jewish people and the Israelis of the Kotel. The reaction from Israel, from B'nai B'rith, Jews throughout the world was fast, it was furious. UNESCO Director General Irina Bukova, whom we have been critical of many times in the past, took the rather unusual step of deploring the resolution of the executive board as a provocation. Even countries that routinely vote for almost any outrageous anti-Israel resolution put pressure on the Palestinians to reverse course. The Arab states ultimately backed down, but the final resolution was still a bold distortion of reality. The Kotel was not named as part of the Al-Aqsa, but the resolution did still use the term Al-Burak Plaza, not the Kotel or even the Western Wall, to condemn Israel for building an elevator in the Western Wall Plaza. The Temple Mount was still not, in the UN imagination, the Temple Mount, but only the Al-Haram al-Sharif, which is their term. And finally, the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs and Rachel's tomb were listed as mosques and as Palestinian sites. Again, erasure of history, robbing us of our history, with the full panoply of countries just kind of going along. And you would think that at least those countries that are majority Christian would have had pause and taken pause at this, but they did not. The final resolution was approved, 26-6, with 25 abstentions, a successful attempt by the Palestinians and the United Nations body to rewrite history, deny Jews their identity, while at the same time further inflaming tensions in the region. And allow me for a moment to conclude by thanking the countries that stood up for sanity, historical reality, and peace at UNESCO with their votes against this resolution. The United States, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Germany, the Netherlands, and in this case, the United Kingdom. Well, a lot to talk about. It's been 15 years since the outbreak of the Second Palestinian Intifada. Sadly, this period has provided many episodes that serve as painful reminders of the urgency of the problem we continue to face in the struggle against hatred of the Jewish people and the Jewish state, including an ongoing wave of contemporary anti-Semitism and a series of assaults against Israel. As we gauge our progress in this battle, we must commit ourselves to sustaining the forward momentum of the global fight for Jewish and Israeli security. That struggle will take place here in Washington, at the United Nations, its various agencies around the world, and in capitals throughout Europe, Latin America, and elsewhere. The path forward will undoubtedly be difficult, but B'nai B'rith is mindful of our obligation to stand for a strong Israel against those who would demonize and delegitimize it, and for a real process of negotiations that will bring peace to Israel and its people. In the words of Theodor Herzl, our opponents maintain that we are confronted with insurmountable political obstacles, but that may be said of the smallest obstacle if one has no desire to surmount it. Well, our commitment is clear, and B'nai B'rith is clear in its determination to do all we can through our global network of activists, all of you, to stand by Israel in the perilous times that lie ahead. Thank you.